is 5 a.m. in New York City, 10 a.m. in London. Good morning. I'm Matt Miller in for Bonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Let's get you set up for the day. Stocks are soaring and the dollar dips after the U.S. and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. Oil drops back below solidly $100 a barrel as ships await a temporary reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and treasuries rally with bets that the Fed will resume its rate cuts and auction for 10-year notes on deck this afternoon. Let's take a look at what's going on in the markets. You can see S&P futures at their session highs right now, up 2.7%. NASDAQ futures up 3.5%. And the small caps doing even better. So a massive rally here, and we have seen a massive rally in Europe as well, with some benchmark indexes rising almost 5% this morning. Take a look at what's going on in Treasuries here. You can see the rally pushing down on yields. So the 2-year yield down 7 basis points to 371, 372. The 10-year yield down 6 to 423 even, and the 30-year yield down 3 basis points to 484. Of course, most importantly, oil, or at least it has been driving this market over the past month and weeks as the war kicked off. Brent crude down 14%. to 94.45. We are looking at NYMEX WTI down 16%, and at one point it had been down almost 20%. Right now trading at $95. Yesterday it traded up to $117, and we saw Brent crude for delivery reach an all-time record since record keeping began. Gas, oil, fuel trading on the Intercontinental Exchange down almost 20% as well, 18% the drop there. For some of the individual stock stories that we're watching this morning, let's get out to London. Chloe Millay is standing by. Chloe, what have you got?
Good morning, Matt. As you just mentioned, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, this 2-week ceasefire that has been announced, has sent oil prices tumbling. And so we are seeing that reflected in the shares of those big oil companies that had, of course, been really benefiting from this major disruption to global energy supplies since the beginning of the year. So we're seeing this reversal in sentiment and all of those names falling significantly today. On the flip side, we've got airlines that are doing much better. This is a sector that had really struggled since the beginning of the conflict because of flight cancellations and also because of rising jet fuel shortages and prices. And so now this ceasefire comes as a huge relief, and we're seeing those names move much higher in pre-market trading. And finally, there is a lot of broad-based optimism across equities, and another sector that's benefiting is the chip stocks. They had been struggling as well since the beginning of the war because of concerns about higher energy costs and higher yields. And today this also comes as a big relief, and therefore we are in the green as well for those chip sector.
All right, Chloe, thanks very much. We'll get back to you a little bit later on. Coming up also in this hour, Tina Fordham is going to join us of Fordham Global Foresight with a closer look at the ceasefire deal, plus its implications on global growth with Lucy Baldwin of Citi. Let's talk about that U.S.-Iranian agreement to stop the fighting just hours before Trump's genocidal deadline. The president made an announcement on social media cautioning the pause is contingent on the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's foreign minister said safe passage through the waterway will be possible during that time, and vows that Iran will cease defensive operations if attacks are paused. Let's get to our team coverage with Bloomberg's Jumana Bersetchi and Washington Deputy Bureau Chief Laura Davidson. Jumana, first to you, what do we know about the 10-point plan that the Iranians put forward? President Trump apparently said that was a good basis point for negotiations. What do the Iranians want?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a very pertinent question because we're heading into what will be 2 weeks of intense negotiations, we imagine, over the coming days. And the starting point for that are some of the very maximalist demands that Iran have laid out. That 10-point proposal, now, President Trump has described it as being a workable starting point, but some of the demands are indeed quite maximalist, and I would say non-starter for many in the region, including the right to sovereignty still over the passage of vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, a full cessation of hostilities, assurances that the U.S. will not strike again. They would like to maintain the series of proxies that they have in the region, the so-called axis of resistance. And indeed, they've actually linked the ceasefire in Iran to ongoing operations in Lebanon as well, something which the Israeli Prime Minister has come back and said they would not accept on their part. And then beyond that, they're also asking for war reparations as well. So a broad list of demands coming through from Iran, very maximalist, unlikely that the U.S. would actually concede to those demands, but a starting point for discussions. And indeed, I will tell you, we are in a very different place than where we were about 12 hours ago when there was a real fear that this could perhaps escalate out of control. Today, the region is breathing a sigh of relief, but it is very tenuous, and we've got to see what the next couple of days brings.
All right, so far from the unconditional surrender that President Trump demanded at the outset of this war, yesterday he threatened the death of an entire civilization. Laura, how does the president spin this as a victory?
So this is a standard Trump playbook of, despite what the actual facts may say, or if a deal has really been achieved here, he's gone out and declared victory. I'll note that, as Jumana said, this is a very tenuous agreement. It is just 14 days. It is not at all clear yet if each side is able to turn this into some sort of more durable peace deal. Right now we have, based on the statements coming out from both sides, both the U.S. and Iranian sort of statements indicate they're seeing this and hearing what they want to hear from each other. For example, Trump has said that the U.S. military is going to help escort ships through the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian side has said that their military will also be involved in that. So there's a lot of discrepancy here about exactly how this 14-day, these top-line agreements are implemented, much less, something more lasting, regarding Iranian's nuclear program, its ballistic missile arsenal, for example. But it's clear that Trump was under a lot of pressure at home. He had, people who had been allies, folks like Tucker Carlson, Republican senators in Congress who were really criticizing his statements and rhetoric from a day or two ago, suggesting he was going to return Iran to the Stone Ages. That really all proved to be too much, coupled with the economic pressure that voters are feeling and really warning signs ahead of the midterms. That all culminated into what we saw transpire just about 12 hours ago.
Jumana, the president has repeatedly claimed that the U.S. military has achieved complete and total regime change, even though it seems like the IRGC is still in charge of the same theocratic regime. Do we know who's negotiating on behalf of Iran?
Well, you raise a very important point, which is, and what some people say quite flippantly is there's been a replacement of one Khamenei with another Khamenei, obviously his son, the son of the former supreme leader. But ultimately, just stepping away from that, there doesn't appear to be at least visible signs of regime disintegration. And we know that the hardliners from the Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, the clerics have been calling the shots here. They've been very vocal, obviously, on social media. A lot of this war has played out in social media. Now, Iranian state media reported a couple of hours ago that into these potential in-person discussions in Islamabad, they may be sending the Speaker of the House, that is Mohammad Ghalibaf. He has been one of the most vocal and strident voices. If you look at everything he's posted over the course of the last couple of weeks, nothing would have suggested that they would actually come to the table and start these negotiations. And I think a lot of that can be credited to Pakistan, who played a key role in mediation here, and also to China as well, something which President Trump has referenced himself, the role that China played in also bringing Iran to the table. But to go back to what we were saying here, Iran has identified that they have a new leverage point, and this is a point that did not exist a couple of weeks ago in the Strait of Hormuz. So in addition to the demands that they were looking to negotiate even before the war even started, there's now an additional point of leverage. That is the Strait of Hormuz. So if the U.S. say that they've managed to regain full and free shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, but not deal with the other issues, then we're sort of back to square zero again.
Free being an important word there, considering the fact that the Iranians seem to want to charge a toll on ships passing through the strait that they also seem now to control. Jumana Bersetchi and Laura Davison, thanks very much for joining us. We'll talk to you, I'm sure, a lot throughout the day. We really appreciate your hard work. Oil plunging below $100 a barrel. WTI posting its biggest drop since the pandemic and U.S. natural gas futures the lowest since August. Let's bring in Bloomberg energy reporter Anthony DePaola in Dubai. And Anthony, it's been pointed out a few times already last night and this morning that there's really an asymmetric set of probabilities here. I mean, it would be really difficult to get oil back down below 80. Surely impossible to get back below 60 where it had been at the beginning of the year for NYMEX. But anything goes wrong and it instantly jumps back above $100. Do you see it that way as well?
Well, we're certainly in a risky period here. So the market is taking a deep sigh of relief. As Jumana had just mentioned, the region is reacting to the fact that we haven't seen an escalation of the war here in this region, and that impacts oil markets as well too, because there was a threat against a lot of infrastructure. So that's why we're seeing this big sigh of relief in the market. But we are clearly not out of the woods yet. There remains a lot of oil stuck inside the Persian Gulf, both crude oil as well as refined products, and that needs to clear. With the uncertainty around the terms of how open the Strait of Hormuz will be, if that's going to be open with only the permission of Iran, whether there's going to be some payments involved there, that is still very unclear. And those tankers inside the Gulf need to clear first before we can get oil flowing back to the market. Then we would have to see, once that safe passage is proven, tankers that are willing to come into the Gulf and pick up crude oil, at which point some of those producers inside the Gulf could resume loading new barrels of crude, newly produced oil, because a lot of those producers were forced to shut down because they couldn't export the oil. Storage tanks became full and they had to shut in production. So we really need to see the flow begin before we can see that oil production ramp up. And shippers, producers, buyers are really asking for certainty before they move into that process of normalizing. So we're not going to see the prices coming down until we do see that. So we are still in this, and we've still got some ways to go before we can see some normalization and those prices falling, as you mentioned before, Matt.
Anthony, many of us are tourists in this market and have been learning a heck of a lot over the last couple of months. Dated Brent, which is apparently the barrels of oil for almost immediate delivery, hit an all-time record yesterday, since record keeping began in the 80s. And of course, we've all been hearing about how much jet fuel is costing the carriers. How are these other barrels or distillates being priced right now?
Yeah, so the Gulf is a big exporter of middle distillates. That's diesel, which goes into trucks, so highly important fuel for all kinds of transport, as well as the jet fuel, which they ship a lot of that, had been shipping a lot of that to Europe. So the Gulf is really important, particularly for the European supply of those middle distillates, whereas the crude oil is going, lots of that is going mainly to Asia, as well as smaller amounts coming to Europe. So it's a really key market for that. And so we have seen the products really increasing because they've been blocked in. You mentioned the dated Brent price. So another thing is price discovery here. When the benchmarks that set Gulf oil are pretty much trapped inside the Gulf, traders don't really have the benchmarks on which to price the crude. So we've seen oil that loads outside of the Gulf, that's the Omani crude, those prices have been skyrocketing, whereas Dubai crude, which is it's a very small flow in terms of barrels, but the price is set based on a lot of other crudes in the Gulf that come out, and those have not been moving. So traders are really scratching their heads on how do we price these things, what is the benchmark, and then that has led to some real dislocations, particularly on things like those products which haven't been able to get to the market, and that's been exacerbating the issue of the crude that hasn't been able to get to the market and get into the refineries to make those fuels. So we've really seen that back up, particularly on those middle distillates, diesel and jet, as you said, Matt.
All right, Anthony, really appreciate your coverage. Anthony DePaola there covering the oil markets for us. Coming up, more implications of the ceasefire deal with Tina Fordham of Fordham Global Foresight out of London next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Matt Miller. Jennifer Kavanaugh of the libertarian think tank Defense Priorities weighing in on the latest ceasefire deal between Washington and Tehran, saying that it's a relief President Trump took an off-ramp, and I think almost everyone would agree with her there. But she said if he was going to back down, he did so in the worst way, raising the stakes so high beforehand. He maximized the damage to his credibility and global perceptions of U.S. power. This is a clear strategic defeat for the U.S. Let's ask Tina Fordham, founder and geopolitical strategist at Fordham Global Foresight, how she sees it. And Tina, I think you'd agree it's a tremendous relief that we didn't decide to bomb Iran back to the Stone Ages and kill millions of people. But how do you think it looks the way we went about it?
Well, I was just talking to some clients here in Europe, some of our corporate clients, about how it looks. And of course, there's relief. And yet, the idea of thinking the unthinkable, of an American president threatening to, mass murder, in effect, on a country of 92 million people and then scaling back from it, it leaves scars. And I think that has to be understood. And one of the things that my client said is the unpredictability of the U.S. is forcing them to reconsider their plans, because I think everybody understands that this ceasefire buys time for 2 weeks. The proof is in the pudding in terms of whether ships will actually traverse the Strait of Hormuz, and insurers will be willing to put that cargo and those sailors at risk. And then there are the implications of Iran effectively coming out of this in a stronger position than they started.
I wonder why the president continues to restate that we've achieved complete and total regime change when it looks like the same people are in charge, albeit, the sun rather than the Ayatollah. But the IRGC and this theocratic regime that everyone has had such problems with for past 47 years remains unchanged. How do you see that?
I see it as a consequence of a policy that really painted the White House into a corner. Whether it's because the Israelis oversold the prospects of regime change or some other, element of White House policymaking, and the fact that the war aims of this operation were never telegraphed, were never presented to the American people. We only saw the U.S. Treasury Secretary on the U.S. Sunday morning talk shows. The war is unpopular with Americans. People will be relieved in the short term at calling victory, if indeed it ends up being that way. But any outcome, from a market perspective and a global economy perspective, that leaves Iran in control of the Strait, one of the world's most significant choke points, effectively using it as a toll road, can't be seen as a victory. It means that regime now has a near permanent source of leverage. And why would they give that up?
What about the nuclear situation, Tina? What was your analysis of the previous agreement where we, through diplomatic means, had been checking on the enriched uranium, the JCPOA? And what do you think? How do you think we stand now that most likely that highly enriched uranium is buried, but we actually don't know exactly where it is?
Well, we don't know, and there were some suggestions that there might have been some special forces operation to recover those highly enriched uranium supplies. But your question is very well taken, because, of course, President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, a diplomatic agreement which had its many flaws and yet did include an inspection element. And whatever happens with Iran and its supplies, which it's always seen as a source of both national pride and protection from invasion, we're looking at the widening of a nuclear arms race in the region, with the other countries, Gulf and otherwise, also looking to obtain this. Countries like Pakistan already, previously agreeing a security pact with Saudi Arabia. And so the job of monitoring and enforcing some kind of international infrastructure to prevent the use of weapons of mass destruction now became a lot harder. And of course, every country is going to want one.
I wonder about, President Trump had demanded an unconditional surrender at the beginning of this war. And now Iran has laid out 10 conditions under which it will surrender. How does he negotiate those conditions, especially considering that part of that we understand is that the U.S. military and Israeli forces stop attacking Iran's proxies while Benjamin Netanyahu continues his war in Lebanon?
Well, indeed. So when it comes to U.S. diplomacy, I mean, the Iranians, who have an amazing trolling game, if you haven't seen it on X, say that they aren't in touch with anyone. And what does appear to be transpiring seems to be by text message, still involving the Omanis. Now, of course, Pakistan, not usually a security and diplomacy partner for the United States on major agreements. And I think what we're seeing, Matt, is the limitations of real estate transaction diplomacy by text message.
Tina, what's the most important element that you're watching for in the next few hours and days?
Traffic through the strait, whether ships get through, what the kind of selection process is, how much good faith compliance there is with this agreement. We've already seen Israel saying that it won't refrain from its incursions into Lebanon. And, what's called cheating in international affairs. Who cheats first, and how they do it.
All right, Tina Fordham, great to get your insight. Really appreciate it. Tina Fordham there of Global Fordham Insight talking to us from London. It's time now for your front page news. First up on the New York Times, the Republican win in the special election runoff in Georgia to replace Marjorie Taylor Greene. Democrats had hoped for a strong showing, but Clay Fuller will serve out the rest of Greene's term in the House after receiving endorsement from President Trump. Next up on the Wall Street Journal, President Trump rebuffed requests from Ford and other U.S. automakers for relief from aluminum tariffs, fires at major U.S. factories, creating bottlenecks, or one in particular, for vehicles such as the F-150 have added to Ford's challenges. And finally, the Financial Times reporting that Perplexity's revenues have jumped 50% in a month as the company leans into AI, really its only business. The company shifted from its chatbot-style search engine to AI agents that carry out tasks on behalf of users. Taking a look at what's going on in markets today, it is particularly remarkable to see oil coming down double-digit percent. So Brent crude off now 14% to $93.86 a barrel for June delivery. NYMEX crude down 16% to $94.93 for May delivery. And at one point we saw crude down, NYMEX crude down 20% from a high of $117 a barrel yesterday. Interestingly, gold rallying up 2% now to $4,800 a troy ounce. In terms of futures, we see absolutely massive moves in European cash markets. Some indexes up as much as 5%. The DAX, for example. S&P futures gaining 2.7% right now as the dollar comes down and the 10-year yield drops, with investors buying bonds. We have a 10-year auction today that we'll be paying very close attention to as well. Coming up, we speak with Lucy Baldwin of Citi on global growth amid the U.S.-Iran ceasefire. This is Bloomberg. It is 5:30 a.m. in New York City, 10:30 a.m. in London. Good morning. I'm Matt Miller in for Vonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Let's get you set up for what is already looking like an absolutely amazing trading day. Stocks are soaring, and the dollar dips after the U.S. and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. We see oil plummeting back below $100 a barrel as ships await a temporary reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and treasuries are rallying hard with bets that the Fed will now be able to resume rate cuts and auction for 10-year notes on deck later this afternoon that we will all be paying very close attention to. Take a look at S&P futures as European cash indexes move 5% higher in Germany. S&P futures are up 2.7%. NASDAQ and Russell futures up 3.5% and more. So an absolute rally, and we have a lot of trading desks saying get ready for more as hedge funds and CTAs cover shorts. You can see yields down across the curve. The 2-year yield down 7 basis points to 372. The 10 down 6 to 423.40. And the U.S. 30-year yield down 3 basis points at 484. In terms of the moves in oil, which have been spectacular as of late, Brent crude now down 14% for June delivery to $93.94 a barrel. NYMEX crude, which yesterday reached $117 for the May contract, is now down 16% at 95 even. And you can see gas oil futures also down almost 20% right now. Amazing moves in stocks as well. For that, let's get out to London. Chloe Melee is standing by. Chloe, what have you got?
Good morning, Matt. This 2-week ceasefire that's been announced and the temporary reopening of the Strait of Hormuz have sent oil prices falling very, very significantly. And so therefore, we are seeing this impact being translated into a lot of negative moves in pre-market trading for all of that oil sector, which, of course, had really benefited over the last few weeks from this disruption in global energy supplies. And then on the flip side, we've got airlines really moving higher this morning, all in the green because oil prices are falling. This is, of course, a sector that had been struggling since the start of the war because of flight disruptions, but also because rising oil prices meant higher jet fuel prices. And so this news of a ceasefire is really coming as a big relief. And so we are seeing the likes of Delta and United being definitely in the green this morning. And finally, another key sector that is moving higher is chip stocks. There had been concerns since the start of the war that those higher energy prices and those higher yields from the Iran war would really impact the AI sector negatively. And so this is another industry that is seeing this ceasefire as a big relief. And so we are seeing the likes of NVIDIA and Micron moving definitely higher this morning as well.
All right, Chloe, thanks very much. Chloe Melee with some of your stock movers that we'll continue to track throughout the day. Now, Washington and Tehran buying more time to come up with a longer-term agreement after notching a 2-week ceasefire. President Trump made the announcement just hours before his deadline, cautioning that the pause is contingent upon reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's foreign minister said safe passage through the waterway will be possible during that time and vows that Iran will cease defensive operations if attacks are paused. Joining us now from Washington is Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. And Tyler, I think we can all say this is a huge relief on both sides of the aisle. There was great concern when the president tweeted out yesterday morning that he may destroy the entire civilization. How will the White House spin this as a victory?
Well, hey, Matt, good morning. At this point, of course, this is a pulling back of President Trump's threats and also the bar. I know that you mentioned this earlier in the program that the president had previously set for what he called unconditional surrender. But we're going to have to wait and see how negotiations unfold over the next 2 weeks. This White House is expected to tout the tactical successes of the military operation so far. We are awaiting a briefing later this morning from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, as well as the Joint Chiefs of Staff Dan Kane. Now, President Trump has said that the Iranian side has provided this 10-point plan that will make for a good basis for negotiations going forward. But there's definitely questions here as we glean more details, because many of them seem like unlikely terms for the U.S. and Israel, including that Iran is able to have sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. Now, we'll have to ultimately see what comes out of this deal. President Trump did give an interview to the AFP overnight where he said that some of the top sticking issues for the U.S., like Iran's highly enriched stockpile of uranium is going to be, quote, completely taken care of. So I think that as negotiations go on, the White House will be giving us more details on what they view as successes of this military operation.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the president deals. I know he didn't give any details with that highly enriched uranium. But what about the Strait of Hormuz, Tyler? I mean, one of the conditions that Iran has laid out is that it will be in charge of traffic through the strait. It wasn't before the U.S. and Israel started this war. How does the president want the U.S. military to aid in getting those 800 ships currently stuck in the Gulf out through Hormuz?
Well, we're awaiting more details, but in a late-night post yesterday after his initial post, he said that the U.S. would be hanging around, in his words, when it comes to the strait. Perhaps we will end up seeing some sort of naval escorts. We heard from the French President Macron earlier as well that there's going to be this group of 15 countries that could provide some sort of assurances when it comes to the strait, but that ceasefire needs to be fully in place in order for them to deploy assets. But the fact that Iran is still signaling intent to have control over the waterway really could complicate the bid for a longer-term deal, considering this White House has made clear that they don't think that Iran should be allowed to charge tolls in the strait, something that appears to be moving forward as this ceasefire is being implemented. In fact, President Trump had said the other day from the White House press briefing room that he thinks the U.S. should be allowed to gain tolls from the strait. We'll see how this develops. Of course, President Trump has also previously indicated that he thinks that the U.S. should seize Iranian oil. Bloomberg News had reporting just yesterday that the president had floated that idea to advisors, not necessarily to gain leverage over Iran, but really to gain leverage over China, though, of course, sources had cautioned Bloomberg that that plan wasn't something that was going to be set in motion, at least just yet. But as we continue to get details on what this could entail, the strait will remain a top focus, as it has been for this White House.
Tyler, thanks very much. Bloomberg's chief Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall talking to us about the White House response. Joining us now to talk more about the market response is Lucy Baldwin, global head of research at Citi. And Lucy, I noted this morning a number of trading desks had been, I guess, cautioning that we'll see maybe a melt up here as hedge funds and CTAs cover shorts. How is the market positioned going into this?
Good morning. Yes, look, I think you're absolutely right. You know, people have been pretty defensively, cautiously positioned, and this morning's reaction, therefore, is you're seeing that covering of a number of those positions. So whether that's around the globe, markets like Korea or Japan, whether that's areas like Europe or emerging markets that had obviously been very much in the crosshairs of this, being major energy importers and incredibly reliant on the Strait of Hormuz for that energy. So you're seeing that sort of unwind of what we've seen over the course of the last few weeks. And then I think as you go forward, right, there'll be a lot of focus on central banks and their ability to sort of resume their cutting cycle around the globe. And I think there'll be a lot of people looking at those sort of long duration trends. So, for example, you know, the ECB, many had started to assume and price in rate hikes on the back of the inflation that we would have seen if that oil price had stayed above 100 for a long period of time. You know, that again is another one where you're seeing that, you know, that change now. And obviously, you know, for us, for example, we expect to see the Fed later on this year resuming the cutting cycle. So I think there's no doubt that there is relief in markets. But I think it's worth saying that also in many ways, right, markets had been quite resilient. And for most people, I think the base case had been some level of a return to not necessarily full normality, but to return to the straight opening later in the year. For many, that was in the second quarter. And so this, I think, for a lot of people will put things back on track for a growth environment for the full year that looks more like trends sort of in the upper 2s towards 3% global growth. If, of course, and this is the big if and the big question, this ceasefire can be maintained and that 10-point plan can be worked through over the course of the next few days and weeks.
Lucy, you know, Europe and a lot of Asian markets had drastically outperformed the U.S. last year. Of course, they had a lot of catching up to do because the U.S. has been outperforming for the better part of a decade. But I wonder if you think that continues now that we're in a ceasefire, if we hopefully get a longer-term peace deal, because Europe's dependence on gas from the Middle East and oil has really been laid bare. It really doesn't seem to have much of a plan in terms of powering its own businesses and consumers. So what happens to that sort of competition with regional assets going forward?
Yeah, look, I think, as you say, there's a number of questions longer term around Europe and the security and supply of gas and oil. But I think markets, as you say, will be focusing on what were the big themes at the beginning of this year before this. If you go back 6 to 8 weeks, what were the big themes? One, as you mentioned, was around this diversification thematic. As you suggest, last year the US didn't perform as well as certain other markets. Europe, EM, etc., had a better year in terms of equity price performance. And I think there'll be a lot of people assuming that you get a resumption of that thematic because of this broader diversification theme, not just, potentially in certain areas, across the globe, but also down the market cap spectrum. And of course, that's what you're seeing today, even within the US market, the performance of the Russell, etc. So there's that broadening thesis that we think is playing out, and that will resume on the back of this ceasefire, as you say, assuming that's capable of holding. And I think the other important thing as well as that is the massive debate discussion around the AI trade, right? We've seen the performance of the picks and shovels trade, the semi-cap equipment, etc. And I think, one of the big debates clearly in the market, aside from the conflict with Iran, has obviously been around software and what the terminal value for a sector like software is, previously seen as sort of stable, sticky, recurring revenue streams. And what are the other, if you like, asset-light sectors that could be disrupted from AI longer term versus the sort of more traditional asset-heavy sectors where you probably assume there is less likelihood of AI disruption. And again, I think some of those thematics that had been very much in focus at the start of this year will come back to the fore. I would just flag we have had a 7,700 S&P target on the back of good earnings growth that we'd expected this year through for the US. And I think, what we'd been careful not to do is downgrade that too hastily on the back of the conflict. Of course, if this had been a prolonged conflict and oil prices had stayed high, that would have been a risk to growth and to earnings for sure. But I think, this will give conviction that the US market, as well as the rest of the globe, and that broadening thesis can hold, the US market can resume some good momentum in many cases.
All right, Lucy Baldwin, great to get some time with you. Really appreciate you joining us. Lucy Baldwin there, head of research at Citi. Let's get to some of the other top stories trending on the terminal this morning. Moody's cut the outlook for Blue Owl's flagship private credit fund from stable to negative. The cut was driven by, quote, significantly higher than peer redemption requests in the first quarter, end quote. Blue Owl had received requests from investors to cash in on almost 22% of outstanding shares in the first 3 months of the year, but capped redemptions at 5%. Elon Musk is seeking to have OpenAI CEO and board member Sam Altman removed from his role as part of Musk's legal challenge to OpenAI's conversion to a for-profit company. Musk wants a court order restoring its status as a nonprofit. OpenAI says the lawsuit is nothing more than a harassment campaign that's driven by ego, jealousy, and a desire to slow down a competitor. That was all a direct quote, by the way. Big funds are piling into treasuries and AI stocks, as Lucy was just telling us. Amid this ceasefire, the actions point to tentative confidence that the worst of the sell-off may be over. Many traders, however, remain uneasy about the 2-week ceasefire, with few details on its terms, like that 10-point plan, the conditions offered by Iran. Coming up, more than 800 vessels still trapped in the Strait of Hormuz as ship owners await the temporary reopening and look for insurance. More on that next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Matt Miller in for Vonnie Quinn in New York. Bloomberg's Anthony DePaula has been talking to us about oil, and I want to bring him back out of Dubai to get the latest read. It's obviously a minute-by-minute market here, Anthony, but the moves are all in the same direction after the great relief that we won't see a civilization destroyed in Iran. What do we know about movement through the Strait of Hormuz, and how is that supporting prices?
Yeah, good morning, Matt. Well, Hormuz is exactly what we're watching today as we try to see whether the market kind of bites on this ceasefire and starts to move cargoes out of the Gulf. Of course, the oil market has taken a big step down on it as we see this positive step of the fact of not waking up this morning in the Middle East to see the U.S. and Iran reciprocally bombing the power plants and desalination facilities in the region. So that's been a positive, taking that risk away from destruction of additional energy infrastructure. But now the next step is going to be if the market trusts this ceasefire, trust that it's going to hold for the 2 weeks, and that passage through the Strait of Hormuz is safe. So that's one of the things that has come up in the talks, some conflicting views there, with the Trump administration saying that the ceasefire is dependent on Hormuz opening up, the Iranians saying they want to continue controlling it and continuing to charge people for that. So we are watching this bulk of tankers and other vessels that are still inside the Persian Gulf to see whether they will move through. Of course, a trickle of Iranian vessels have been taking their oil out today, even during the previous days of the war, and some countries that are allied with Iran have been allowed to pass through at a fee. So now we need to see what the terms are for other tankers to get through, and whether they will be able to go through. So there's going to need to be some confidence building first before those tankers start flowing and bringing that oil back to the market.
What about, Anthony, the infrastructure that has been shut off or damaged in this war? How quickly can it be repaired or turned back on?
Yeah, so the main things that we've seen damaged so far, of course, is that Qatari LNG production there. We've seen that it's been put back by years in terms of some of the supplies that the Qataris said they could ship into countries like in Europe, for example. Other facilities that have been damaged have been refineries. The biggest refinery in the Gulf, which is in the UAE, not fully back yet. The biggest refinery in Saudi Arabia has been hit, has resumed some production. But those facilities are both on the Persian Gulf, so they won't be able to fully restart anyway until they can resume production. In terms of damage to fields, it's harder to damage a field, of course, because it's mostly underground. You've got to hit the oil processing facilities. Saudi Arabia's got a massive one at Cake that was hit in 2019 so far. That's not been hit. And Sheba is another big facility that's been repeatedly targeted, but so far we don't think that that's been damaged. So the production facilities seem to still be there. However, a lot of production has been shut in simply because the producers couldn't get it out of the region. So they had to stop producing because the storage tanks filled up. We'll see if this 2-week period lasts for that long, and if we get some relief by vessels leaving the Gulf, but also coming back in to pick up some more oil. So we're really watching that intently. First the ships, and then the production level, Matt.
All right, Anthony, really appreciate your reporting. Anthony DePaula there out of Dubai. Let's talk more about the ships there, because the energy sector's mood has been lifted by the ceasefire. That's why we've seen big drops, as much as 20% for forward contracts of oil. But ship owners still remain uncertain on the key details, as more than 800 vessels are trapped in the Persian Gulf. You're looking at maps go on the Bloomberg terminal. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Alaric Nightingale, who leads our team covering European oil trading out of London. Alaric, what are you hearing about the effort to get ships out? Are they prepared with the proper insurance, and do they trust, the Iranians well enough to move through? Because lives are something that you can't insure against losing.
Those are great questions and really cut to the heart of the matter. I think in terms of the insurance, from the people we've spoken to this morning, there's definitely a great deal of caution about the cover and the willingness of the shipping industry to take that cover, even if it's on offer. So you have a kind of a chicken and egg. The insurance industry needs to kind of price it, but to price it, it needs to see flow. And there's lots of different aspects to the risk profile of every ship. If you've got a ship that's linked to China, maybe that's less risky than one that's linked to the US. Those kinds of things all need to be worked out. And you need to see a kind of a good amount of passage before you can accurately price it, and therefore you kind of got a bit of an impasse there to figure out at least. And then in terms of the owners' attitudes, yeah, they're cautious. You know, it's absolutely not crystal clear about what this ceasefire really looks like, what the practicalities are. You know, can ships just go through Strait of Hormuz without any kind of impediment? You know, lots of things need to be addressed.
Eric, what do we know about the toll? I mean, I've heard reports, and as I'm sure you have as well, that Iran is charging a $2 million toll per ship. Is that, you know, still being levied?
I mean, these are numbers that get talked about, and I'm sure that there is a charge, well, in some instances, but I would also expect it to be a little bit more variable than just a flat fee of $2 million per vessel. But yeah, that's another issue. If Iran is able to kind of insist on, or if Iran does insist on charges, that may be unacceptable to some. Right. And even just paying those charges could be a kind of a sanctions problem.
All right, Alaric, really appreciate your reporting. Alaric Nightingale there runs our oil coverage out of London. I will say the Wall Street Journal says that Iran is telling ship owners permission is still necessary in order to transit the strait. This is Bloomberg. Just a quick look here as we come to the top of the hour at oil. Right now, Brent crude for June delivery down 14% at $94.30 a barrel. NYMEX crude for May delivery down 16% at $94.68 as we get a 2-week truce in the Strait of Hormuz. S&P future soaring 2.7% as European markets rise more than 4% at some benchmarks. That's it for Bloomberg Brief. Surveillance is ahead. This is Bloomberg.